Um, Good morning, and thank you all for being here. The session this morning will be about telling stories of yesterday and today while designing for the future, inclusive design in museums. Can you all hear me?
No.
Hear me.
That's just for the recording. That's not going into the room anywhere.
So should I need to speak louder? Can you hear me? No? Okay. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about us first. We are the Institute for Human-Centered Design. We are a 46-year-old international education and design nonprofit dedicated to enhancing experiences of all people of all ages, abilities, and from. They cannot hear me, PJ. Do I need another? It's not working.
Use your outside voice. So the microphone is only for the audio for the broadcast. It's not for there's no audio in the room.
Okay, so do I need an additional?
We don't have any additional audio
Okay.
here. Outside voice.
Okay, I'll try it.
Everybody read the captions.
Yes. Okay. So let me start again. Institute for Human-Centered Design. We are a 46-year-old international education and design nonprofit dedicated to enhancing the experiences of people of all ages, abilities, and from a variety of cultures through excellence in design. Our core beliefs: we believe that design powerfully and profoundly influences everyone's sense of confidence, comfort, and control in any settings, especially in museums, and that variation in ability is ordinary, not special, and affects most of us for at least part of our lives. And today we are living longer, and we survived many times longer than before. So if a building program or exhibit works well for people with disabilities, it generally works better for everyone. So we would like to tell you a story about organizations that tell stories and how those stories and their telling are becoming more inclusive for everyone in all types of settings. So today's discussions will include a brief history of accessibility and inclusive design in museums, whose stories museums are beginning to tell, considerations for accessible and inclusive design in physical spaces, consideration on accessibility and inclusive design in exhibitions and programs, and user experts. Co-design and testing of museum programs and prototypes. We work very closely with user experts, meaning people who have experienced life disabilities, either physical or mental or brain-based disabilities. So we'll work very closely with them if we think that if it works for them, it will work for everybody. And this is a quote from the American Alliance of Museums. Museums are a vital story of who we are, who we have been, and how we will live together. We cannot claim to be truly essential to society if we are not accessible to all. So it means that the American Alliance of Museums started to make sure that everybody is included, the disability, inclusion, and accessibility. In all they started to add it in their plan for all aspects of museums. So museums have long told stories, but the stories were usually told from the narrow perspective of a particular group of scholars in ways that were always respectful about the subjects that were not always respectful about the subjects of the stories. And some people, for for different reasons, couldn't even enter the buildings and see and hear the stories that were being told about themselves. So the photograph on the right is an image of a building, an inaccessible building, so with a monumental staircase that leads to the main entrance. So the story we would like to tell today is about inclusive museums. Museums who tell the stories of people with a wide range of abilities, ages, cultures, and personal identities. And inclusive museums not only ensure that communities can enter the building and understand the stories, but also that the stories are told from a respectful perspective. So the photograph on the right, there are two photographs, and those are from the National Museum of Natural History in DC, and they recently added an accessible route to the main entrance, the south entrance of the building. So the top photograph shows the staircase, the entrance on the south side of the building, and the photograph on the bottom is the ramps that were added in, I believe it was 2021, and it was to provide access to the main entrance. So they added ramps on both sides of the building, and the idea was to make sure that everybody will start the way to the museum from the same space at the bottom and arrive to the same area at the top. So that's the way they make the accessible entrance. So John now is going to talk a little bit.
Good morning, everyone. I'm hoping that my always outside voice will carry through. Okay. It helps to have a big mouth sometimes. And if I can just add up to the information on the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum, I started advocating for that ramp back in 1978. So some things come slowly, but it is a great feat when it is accomplished, and this provides mall-side access to the museum, which is quite extraordinary. Accessibility in museums is not a new issue, and it even predates me, which was when I started, it was in 1978. U.S. museums began offering programs for people with disabilities in the early 1900s. On the right is a photograph from the New York Times of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it is a lecture to a group of young kids and it looks like maybe one teenager, all of whom use wheelchairs. The country started really moving forward with significant civil rights legislation, and that was the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Section 504. And if you know the history of that, those regulations did not get signed until 1977. So things moved relatively slowly between the passage of the legislation and the signing of the regulation that got everybody on board. 504 prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in programs that are conducted by federal agencies and in programs that receive federal financial assistance. So Section 504 covers museums that receive funding, say, from NEA or NEH or NSF or NASA. So that's a lot of museums that are covered by Section 504. The photograph below is focused on a 504 demonstration that was led by Kitty Cohn and Judy Heumann, and that's Judy on the right with her Sign 504 button. More significant or additional significant civil rights legislation that really gave a huge bump to the effort for accessibility was in 1990 with the Americans with Disabilities Act. 43 million Americans then, 61 million Americans now, which is 25 to 26% of the US population, require solutions that provide integrated accessibility in facilities, programs, and more. The photograph is of the signing ceremony. That's President George H.W. Bush signing the the legislation. That is Evan Kemp on one side and Justin Dart on the other. Before the early 1970s, a limited number of specially designed galleries for people with specific disabilities were available, and exhibits were mainly inaccessible generally. The Doris Duke Biddle exhibit at the North Carolina Museum of Art, the Wadsworth Atheneum's Lions Gallery, were tactile exhibits that were meant particularly for people who are blind or have low vision. And in some cases, they only allowed people who could see into the exhibits for limited times. It was very clearly focused and very segregated. Programs were all scheduled ahead of time, and visits were limited to groups of people with similar disabilities. So you had the quote-unquote blind tour, you had the quote-unquote deaf tour, and the ADA was really beginning to push towards much more integration. The photograph is of two books that were put out by the Smithsonian. One of them is called Part of Your General Public is Disabled, and the other was Museums and Handicapped Children. The latter was in 1976, and the former was in 1987, excuse me. There were inclusive design guidelines that were beginning to develop across the country. The Museum of Science in Boston published its guidance beginning guidance in 1991. In 1996, the Smithsonian Institution used the ADA requirements that were brand new at that point as a baseline to expand and design inclusive exhibitions. So you have Betty Davidson's book on the left, which is New Dimensions for Traditional Dioramas, and the Smithsonian Guidelines for Accessible Exhibition on the right, and exhibition design rather on the right. And that was much more, it wasn't prescriptive, but it was based on the standards, and it had performance standards that broadened the accessibility to inclusive design. There were inclusive design guidelines going on everywhere, and everyone was talking amongst themselves and growing as we wrote them. The National Park Service had begun development of its guidelines in the late 1980s, with significant revisions in 1999 and 2007, and IHCD is involved with the Smithsonian and the National Park Service now to revise them yet again. And Parks Canada produced media exhibition guidelines in early 1990s. On the left is the National Park Service's brochure, their guidelines rather, which are called Programmatic Accessibility Guidelines for National Park Service Interpretive Media. So theirs were fairly narrow. The Smithsonian guidelines covered all aspects of exhibitions. And then Parks Canada was design guidelines for media accessibility as well. And we were all interacting with each other and working to develop these. In 1997, the principles of universal design brought new creativity to integrated approaches. And IHCD, which was then known as Adaptive Environments, was an original author of the principles. So the principles are equitable use, flexibility in use, simple intuitive use, perceptible information, tolerance for error, low physical effort, size and space for approach and use. So you can see how that is just absolutely perfectly applied to any museum exhibition. On the left is a photograph of an exhibit, an interactive rather, that is at the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Museum in Colorado Springs, Colorado. It is an archery interactive, and there is a tall woman on the right and a small child on the left, and both of them are using the interactive comfortably. Universal design, which IHCD calls inclusive design, builds on a baseline of accessibility requirements. Too often we hear, oh, we're doing universal design, which translates as accessibility light. We kind of choose what we're going to follow and ignore what we don't really want to. Universal design very definitely builds on those accessibility standards. You have to be compliant first, and you build from there. And as for the definition of universal design, this one comes from Ron Mace, who was one of the members of the team that created the principles. He was often called the father of universal design. And he said, universal design is the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. So how do museums tell stories and provide visitors with the confidence, comfort, and control and enjoyment that they expect? On the left is a photograph of one of the user experts that Anna mentioned just a couple minutes ago. The user expert is someone who is blind, and she and a man are the museum staffer to the right of her are examining a tactile experience at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Her service animal is very quietly and carefully sitting in front of her. The important thing to remember about inclusive design and museum exhibitions and museums in general is that it's not only about entrances, ramps, and toilets. When I first started at the Smithsonian, the idea was, okay, well, we're putting in a ramp, or we've got an accessible toilet, so we're accessible, we're done. And we said, well, that's a start, it's a good start, but it's not everything. So museums are beginning to realize that there are a lot of different people with a lot of different needs, and accessibility means something different to everyone. And there are a lot of people who have more than one disability. So that I had a friend who I've lost a couple of years ago to cancer, but she said, we're only allowed to have one disability. And she was a person who had diabetes, juvenile diabetes, she lost her vision because of it, and she also lost her mobility. So when she went to use a tactile experience and couldn't reach it from her wheelchair, people sort of looked at her like, what? And she said, oh, I got more than one disability, so let's think more creatively about how we create these experiences. This is one of my favorite photographs right now. This is the F1 engine in the National Air and Space Museum, and that is a tactile model of the engine in front. And I was wandering through the museum one Sunday, and this woman, the woman and the child had no apparent disabilities, but she was using that as an incredible teaching tool, and she was teaching this 3-year-old in very technical mechanical language all about the F1 engine. And I thought, see, if you make something accessible for people with disabilities, you make it better for everyone else. So museums are telling everyone's stories. Who's everyone? This is a photograph from the U.S. Department of Justice's ADA.gov site, and it is a collection of women who are women of color who all have different disabilities. So who's everyone? According to the CDC, 61 million Americans, or 26% of adults in the U.S. live with a disability, and that 61 million is adults. So it's a much bigger number when you think about it. On the left is a map from the CDC, which points out how big this audience is. When I first started at the Smithsonian, many people said, well, why do we, it's such a small population, why do we have to make all this effort? Well, it's not such a small population, and it benefits everyone. The 2023 National Prevalence Data on Disability, again from the CDC, shows us too that it is not only a matter of toilets and wheelchairs accessible for people who use, toilets and entrances accessible for people who use wheelchairs. 12.1% of people have a mobility disability, and many times that includes people with arthritis, people who have an arm or a leg that has been amputated, people who have difficulty walking. 12.8% of people have disabilities that related to cognition. 7.2% have independent living skills that are causing them to have a disability. 6.1% have a hearing disability, 4.8% have a vision disability, and 3.6% have issues of self-care. So the spectrum is diverse, and we can see that very clearly, that if you just make the toilet and the entrance accessible to a wheelchair user, you're not doing enough for accessibility. Chronic diseases, 6 in 10 adults in the United States have a chronic disease. 4 in 10 adults in the United States have 2 or more. And leading causes of death and disability are leading drivers of the nation's $3.5 trillion costs in annual health care. You can see heart issues, cancer, chronic lung issues, stroke, Alzheimer's, diabetes, and chronic kidney disease are all in the mix. The ADA covers people if it has a significant impact on their lives. And this is not even to mention long COVID, where we all learned how quickly people can gain disabilities. People with disabilities have many personal identities. Visitors who are Black, Latino, Asian, LGBTQ, of all religions, cultures, language, heritages, old and young, wealthy and not, may also have disabilities. So we are not talking about a silo of only white people with disabilities, which was often the case. We have to look at diversity within diversity. Older adults usually have acquired disabilities that are a result of the aging process. You can see in the CDC chart again that 2 in 5 adults over the age of 65 have a disability. 1 in 4 women have a disability. And people with disabilities are part of all society's groups. It's not a matter, again, of either or. You can see the top chart is from the U.S. Department of Education. The red color on the right are kids who are receiving services under IDEA, who are white. Everybody else are people of color. There are 3 in 10 people who are American Indian or Alaska Native who have a disability, 1 in 4 people who are Black, 1 in 5 people who are white, 1 in 6 people who are Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders, 1 in 6 people who are Hispanic, and 1 in 10 people who are Asian. We are a diverse nation, and disability is as diverse as everyone in the nation. Inaccessibility and design that is not inclusive leaves out people from many different groups. You can, on the left is a chart that says an estimated 3 to 5 million people who are LGBTQIA have disabilities. So if we think we're going to develop in museums programs and exhibitions and welcome for people with people of color or people who are LGBTQ, but we don't think about making those accessible, then we're going to leave out a whole section of every one of the populations we are trying to meet. Disabled people are part of everyone's stories, and as this man says, if you want me to feel welcome, I need to see me. So not only do we need to think about the accessibility of our content, of our buildings, of our exhibitions, we have to think about, do people see themselves in them? Are we reflecting the stories of people with disabilities as well? Disabled people are part of everyone's stories. The woman on the left is Marcia Brissett Bailey, the author of Black, Brilliant, and Dyslexic, and she said, we recognize the need for difference of thought, but how can we possibly capture that without different people who have had different experiences? The stories that we tell in museums have to be accurate, accessible, and inclusive reflections of people's experiences. Too long, people with disabilities have been talked about. They've been talked about in medical ways or as victims of, rather than contributors to our society, members of our society, people who we meet and work with every day. On the left is a photograph, far left is a photograph of the portrait of Christopher Reeve that was up in the National Portrait Gallery. And one woman who is a disability activist talked about her children, who both have disabilities, as does she and her husband, walking into the museum and seeing that portrait and stopping dead in their tracks, saying, he's using a wheelchair. I've never seen someone in a museum exhibit who uses a wheelchair. Made a pretty strong point. The second photo over towards the right is an exhibition at the Air and Space Museum, which is called We All Fly. And the movie that is running there is about a pilot who does not have arms and uses her feet to fly the aircraft. The next one over to the right is from the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Museum. It's a photograph of a runner with a prosthetic leg. And the final one, which is a little bit difficult to see, is a work by Christine Sun Kim, who is a deaf artist, and she was part of an exhibition at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. The most important issue to remember in all of this is that it is not an us and them issue. It's all of us in all of our wonderful diversity. And this is a Frida Kahlo painting. Frida Kahlo had a disability due to her very severe accident, vehicle accident, and had multiple surgeries and frequently painted about this disability that she had. Oftentimes you won't see it addressed, or you'll see it addressed improperly, and we need to think about if an artist is painting her own disability, we need to talk about that, and we need to make sure that it is accurate and appropriate. Anna?
Okay, John. So, designing for inclusion, mitigate barriers as necessary. So the goal is to provide visitors the confidence, comfort, control, and enjoyment they expect. We need to understand that each person's experience is different and that we need to welcome everyone. So no museum is perfect yet, but we are all working on it together. So physical access features are important when we think about welcoming people at museums. That's where we start the story of inclusive museums. So first of all, get people into the site and buildings the same way everyone else enters. So make sure that there is an accessible route from the parking, from the public transportation to the entrance, to an accessible entrance. Welcome visitors at accessible information desks, provide well-signed accessible routes through all spaces, including galleries, shops, cafes, classrooms, and auditoriums. So spaces that are unfamiliar are difficult to navigate. So providing well-signed areas or making sure that the wayfinding process is well thought is important in museums. And also it's get people who visit for the first time a sense of control, that they know the space that they can navigate without asking too many questions. Provide assistive listening in assembly areas and put signs to make sure that people know that the system is provided. Offer accessible restrooms, companion care rooms, modern rooms, and quiet areas. Address issues of lighting, acoustic, and seating. And these lighting, acoustic, and seating, those are not things that are mentioned in the accessibility standards, but are things important to consider when we are thinking about other populations, like people who have low vision or elderly people or things like that. And providing seating around museums is important. It's not only important for people with disabilities that may need to sit often, but also just for people that are visiting the museum and want to take a rest from the walkthrough. And provide safe evacuations out if needed. So make sure that there is a clear evacuation plan, that staff knows what to do in case of an emergency, and provide evacuation maps in visible locations, and make sure that there are clearly marked the areas where people who cannot use the stairs can wait for assistance. The photographs on the right, they are showing, the first one is showing the art museum in Worcester, the new accessible, not that new, they did the renovation a few years ago, and it's provided an accessible entrance and in the same location where the stairs are, so everybody is entering the same way. The screenshot in the middle is at the National Air and Space Museum, and they are provided a family care suite. So the family care suites include infant care, nursing rooms, companion care restrooms, and quiet restrooms. And the screenshot at the bottom is at the Museum of African American History and Culture, and those are the signs that they have to provide people can see in case of an emergency. So one is where if people cannot use the stairs, where they can wait, and people who can use the stairs, they can take it without needing to go, because the elevator cannot be taken. New design needs to bake in accessibility and inclusion from the beginning. Some features currently in vogue that may exclude, not include people with disabilities include social stairs and retractable seating. Those are very trending these days. So when the social stairs or the retractable seating is used as an assembly area, you need to make sure that there are accessible spaces. And if it's thought from the beginning, it will provide an opportunity to have accessible settings, accessible seatings integrated into the design. Another trend is extensive use of glass for walls, stairs, and flooring. Multi-level spaces with hard surfaces that reflect sound. So again, paying attention to the acoustic in those spaces. Floor patterns that create optical illusions, slanted or curved walls that become protruding objects, and limited seating, not with back and arm support. So think about the audience when you are doing this new, when you are designing for the museum or renovating a museum. Who is visiting? Think about, John was talking about the statistics of people with disabilities. Can be elderly people, can be people with apparent disabilities or not apparent disabilities. All those people need to be included when you are thinking about new designs. And historic preservation, the ADA has provision on historic preservations, and that applies to buildings or facilities that are eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places, and to buildings or facilities that are designated as historic by the state or local codes. But organizations are not required to do anything that would threaten or destroy the historic significance of a building, but there is no grandfathering or automatic exception if a building is designated as historic. The photograph on the right is of the Smithsonian Institution building. They put an accessible ramp, a reversible ramp. So it's a ramp that can be removed on top of the historic steps that they have. So now they created an accessible entrance to the building, and the ramp can be removed if need be. Maintenance is as important as new construction and renovations. So sometimes elevators are out of service, the only accessible restrooms closed for repairs. Exhibition installations sometimes block the accessible routes or reduce the width of the accessible route. Extensions move to create new inaccessible lines or again reduce the accessible route. Floor polishing very high, that is very difficult to navigate. Lighting, aging or dead bulbs, darken areas, and that's very concerning also in doorways or near signage or near labels. And lower accessible counters filled with items. So there are instances where elevator can be out of service, there are renovations and the toilets are closed, but it's important to let members of the public, visitors to the museums, know when the elevator is out of order, for instance, and for how long, because when those things happen, that means that you don't have an accessible route to certain areas in the museum. So websites as a tool for pre-visit information and closure updates. So this is good to know before you go. The website is a way feature to let people know when the elevator is out of service, for how long is it going to be, and what to do in the meantime to access the museum. So content and functionality are equally important to ensure equitable access. Accessibility of websites on desktops and mobile devices is crucial. So the screenshot on the right is of the accessibility page at the Walters Art Museums. And the same way that maintenance is important in buildings, as important in new construction and alterations, web maintenance is important as important as the design of a new web page. So make sure to design and keep your website with the website content accessibility guidelines that make sure that it's compliant. For instance, for visual design, that there is enough color contrast, that the text size and the type are accessible, that there is no overprinting text on image or backgrounds, and the organization of the content make sure that it's provide the required white space between content. Responsive website designs, and by that I mean make sure that the website is designed to be used by, you can use it on your phone, you can use it on a tablet, you can use it depending on the orientation of the phone, orientation of the tablet. Keyboard accessibility is also very important because many people with disabilities and people without disabilities use keyboard to navigate a website. Make sure that the website works with different assistive technologies and functionality that is available to both on the website and on the app, especially the museum's apps, and accessible ticketing. More and more museums started to use kiosks to provide for people to have their tickets to access the museum. So make sure that those are accessible and that they are located on an accessible route.
We should have explained at the beginning the reason that we're reading the text on the screen and we are describing the images is to make sure that people who can't see or can't see well can still understand what we're talking about in terms of the slides that we're presenting. So one of the most important things in my mind is that museums need to be accessible in what they do so well, what the ADA calls their goods and services, which is inclusive exhibitions and programs. They must be designed to communicate the content. There are times when exhibitions, and I'm looking at Hannah because I'm sure she's heard this before, the idea of exhibition as artifact. They are designed to be beautiful and extraordinary works of art in and of themselves, but they don't necessarily function. So what we're talking about is exhibitions and programs that are wonderful and instructive and beautiful, but they also convey the content that they are meant to. It's essential to think about how that communication is provided for everyone, and choices are presented for people with a range of abilities and ages. On the right is a photograph of a woman who uses a wheelchair at the Air and Space Museum, using some of the tactile experiences in the museums. We emphasize all the time when IHCD works with museums, tactile experiences accompanied by audio description and information make museums come alive for people who are blind or have low vision. We have talked with more than one user expert who says, I'm not going if there's nothing tactile, otherwise it's just one long listening of description. So tactile experiences are one way to make exhibitions more accessible. You also have to have labels that are readable, legible, and mounted for easy viewing. I know many of you have probably gone to the museum exhibition that has mauve on beige labels that are high and they're poorly lit and you can't read them. So we're really encouraging museums to think about word choice, title and sentence order, label format length, and inclusion of diversity in content and language. On the right is a large label collection from the National Aquarium in Baltimore called Just Offshore. Appropriate language about people with disabilities is essential. We talked earlier about the fact that many times people with disabilities were included in exhibitions, but not in ways that were positive, not in ways that were accurate. This was a label that in rough draft was being done for the Air and Space Museum, and in rough draft it says, Sam Schmidt, after a racing accident, rendered him a quadriplegic. Sam Schmidt continued racing with adaptive technology and became a rare team owner. He wore a baseball cap with reflective infrared sensors that transmitted his head movements via camera to a computer. This enabled him to steer and accelerate a specialty equipment 2014 Corvette to 106 miles per hour. Great that they were including someone with a disability in the context of their exhibition, but when we all looked at the transcript, the script of the exhibition, we said, one, rendered him a quadriplegic. It really takes that away from him. It makes him something happened to him that he has absolutely no control of for the rest of his life. And it speaks about him in the past tense. He's still racing. So we worked together to rewrite it, and just the first sentence, Sam Schmidt sustained a spinal cord injury in a racing accident. He continues racing with adaptive technology and has become a race team owner, etc. So thinking about the language that we use when we include people with disabilities is as important, obviously, as including people with disabilities. And up in the left-hand corner is Sam Schmidt, the race car driver inside his car with his adaptive infrared technology on his head. Typeface, size, font, color contrast, and lighting all contribute to readability of labels. On the left is a photograph of a tall man who is bent in half trying to read two very densely written labels in small type, and I brightened up the photograph so you could see it. The lighting was so poor that at one point, he was practically nose to the label. On the right is in a museum which is in Panama, and the problem there is looking up and looking at all the glare that sits on those labels. These are all things that have to be considered. Lighting is essential with label readability. And in the middle is just one of my favorite cartoons that says, I found this nice big font called New Geriatric. And with my glasses and my gray hair, I'm there. A nice big readable font is a good thing. Quiet resetting locations in busy, crowded exhibitions. We hear a lot about sensory-friendly programs and quiet rooms that are set off. And the sensory-friendly programs are oftentimes once a month, sometimes once a year. They are limited and they are fairly segregated. They are really important as a stepping stone to thinking about integrated access for people with brain-based disabilities. And one way to do that is to identify within exhibitions where you can create quiet spaces, where you can create areas that people can feel comfortable in. Physical designs extend beyond accessible paths of travel with provisions for wider aisles, quieter spaces, and mid-exhibit escape routes so that people can leave if they are overwhelmed by crowded, visually and orally heavy exhibitions. This was an exhibition that was at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, and it was the Yayoi Kusama show. It was very crowded, constantly, long lines, people talking, noise, and all of her colors are bright and expressive. And I found this little boy who found a quiet spot, and he got down on the floor, and he was still enjoying the art, but you could almost see him kind of go as he began to just enjoy the art away from everybody else. We advocate for seating that visitors can get into and out of. That means seating with back and arm support, and it doesn't have to be all of it. We can't, there are oftentimes long, low benches that still sit in museum galleries, but Hannah, where she works, they have a collection of wonderful, or worked, past tense, sorry, Hannah. The MFA has a wonderful collection of a variety of seats where people can use the arms and back support to stand up and to sit down. They're high enough so that you don't have to fall into them and never get out of them. This was again at the National Aquarium, and what delighted me most is you can see where everybody's sitting. These are young people who didn't appear to have any disabilities, but it sure was a lot more comfortable to have that back support on the other end rather than the end of the bench that has no support at all. Multisensory approaches are important and enjoyed by everyone. On the left is a photograph of a family, none of whom has an apparent disability, at the North Carolina Aquarium in Pine Knoll Shores. They had a whole exhibition around their aquarium tanks that included tactiles of all the fishes that were in the tanks, and everyone was totally enjoying it. The center is at the FDR Memorial in Washington, D.C., and this is a small tactile that reflects the larger sculpture rather, behind of FDR seated in a wheelchair. And this is called a wayside for the National Park Service, and it includes audio labels as well as the tactile, as well as information that is in print. On the right, the final one is the Indianapolis Children's Museum, which is a treehouse, and they put an elevator into the treehouse so that everybody could get up into the treehouse and enjoy the view from above. One of the biggest problems in museums are protruding objects. These are objects that are above 27 inches from the ground and below 80 inches from the ground, so that particularly people who are blind or have low vision, don't pick up the information that they exist with their canes and walk into them, and can be very dangerous. And you can see in these photographs how they can be dangerous. On the left is a photograph at the Calvert Marine Museum in Solomons, Maryland, and these are cases that are cantilevered off the wall and high and smackable. On the right is at the Biomuseo in Panama City, again in Panama, with the horse leaning way out over, and his hoof is very dangerously located. And then finally, at the also in Maryland, is public art, which frequently becomes a problem because it's all over the place and it's right in the middle of a park, or it's right in the middle of a plaza. But they very cleverly put this up on to a pedestal, and then they put plantings around it, so you really couldn't get to the parts that were overhanging, and it no longer is a protruding object, because unless you're willing to go through all those vines, you probably are not going to be hurt. Mechanical interactives require inclusive controls for everyone. We look at controls that people, for example, can lift flip panels with the side of their hand if they can't grasp or pinch, or can use joysticks as in the center, or if it's something to spin, that it's textured so people can catch it with the side of their hand. Digital interactives require physical access as well as effective communication. So we're thinking about people who use mobility assistive devices being able to get up and under them, and then also you can see on this one they have an induction loop system for hearing assistance, and they, on the far right in the digital frame, is a keypad, so that someone who is blind or has low vision and can't use a touch screen can do everything that everyone else can using the program and get audio through it. You plug in a headset. Linear media requires assistive listening systems, audio description, and captions. And we talked earlier about programs that are segregated and are oftentimes for people with one particular disability. These programs can be incredible stepping stones. They can meet a visitor where he is, but it can also prove to be a bridge to where he could be. Integrated programming has to be a choice as well. So we have up in the corner, Morning at the Museum, which is a Smithsonian-wide program for kids who have sensory processing disabilities, but now it's become a much bigger program. And then to the right is from MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And I just loved this quote. "I realize that when you have Alzheimer's, you don't know if your memory is correct. The program gave me the confidence to know that I had been able to retain my appreciation of art." It's pretty powerful. It isn't, we're here to do therapy for you. It's to say, you can come back. You can still enjoy the art in the separate program, and then you can enjoy it in all the other programs as well. Changing the way we operate at times. This is what the ADA calls modifications of policies, practices, and procedures. Designing for a range of users, use of other power-driven mobility devices, OPDMDs. Only the government could come up with an acronym like that. That's from the U.S. Department of Justice. Eating and drinking within exhibit and program areas. If you have a disability that requires that you snack or get water frequently, carrying a backpack within an exhibition so that if you have equipment that you need to keep with you because you may use it, being able to carry that backpack, and service animals, allowing service animals into the museum. And then finally, user expert co-design and review, people who help museums tell their stories. Anna referred to user experts. We have talked about it during this session. A primary user expert is a person who has developed expertise by means of their lived experience in dealing with the challenges of the environment due to a physical, sensory, or cognitive functional limitation. That is IHCD's definition of user experts. User experts include children with disabilities, older people with changing vision or stamina, adults who are deaf, and wheelchair users, among many others. In the photograph on the left is a woman who is using a wheelchair testing an International Spy Museum lock-breaking interactive. And on the right is a young kid who uses a wheelchair, and he's testing a Spider-Man exhibit and seeing how he can do what all the other kids do in the exhibit space. Working with user experts can be done by co-design, where people are working with exhibit designers to actually think through how the exhibit is presented, and accessibility is at the topmost part of everyone's mind. So as things change, accessibility and inclusion remains. Collaboration doing user expert testing, and then consultation. The photograph on the left is from the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Museum. This was testing that same archery interactive that we saw earlier, and you see on the right, 2 Paralympians. They had the perfect user experts for their museums. They just recruited all their Paralympians, and they tested with various abilities to make sure that those interactives worked. So from a publication or an article called Heck Yes, Accessibility, Let's Make the Future Awesome, the author, Misha Andrews, says, accessibility gives us options, and options allow for innovation. Accessibility breaks us free from constrained visions and lets us more freely interact with the world. Museums can tell awesome stories if they give everyone the option to participate. And a little bit of Boston for time for questions. Do we have a couple of minutes for questions? Does anyone have a question or a comment, or does everyone just want to get up and stretch a little bit?
Patricia. Yes, hi. Can you tell us more about the ramp in front of the Smithsonian, and what advice do you give us for advocates that want to advocate for a ramp in front of a historic, structure?
I think my advice would be, between Worcester and the Natural History Museum and the Smithsonian Institution building, is to say it can be done. It's time consuming and it's expensive. It can be done, and it can be beautiful, and it can work really well. So each one of those, I'm sure Worcester, I don't know, I was involved with the 2 Smithsonian ramps, not Worcester. Anna can talk better to that because she was. It's not an easy sell. It's difficult to think through. But if you saw that, if you think about that photograph at Natural History, it's a funnel. People are using the ramps and the stairs are empty because it's just so much easier for a lot of people. We need the stairs because some people can't use the ramps, but it's so much easier for a lot of people to use the ramps, and making people understand that it can be done.
And also, it has the ramps and the stairs, they are in the same place. It's not that the accessible entrance is back on the other side of the building. Everybody starts going up